If you have been on this group for any length of time, you will know that I'm constantly repeating the mantra that you should not use cold butter in the Ankarsrum. The reason that you do not want to use cold butter in the main bowl is that with the dough roller, although it will not break it, it will not incorporate well, and your butter will basically just be either flung around the bowl uselessly or it will just gather into a clump at the bottom of the dough roller. Because of the mixing mechanism, it will not incorporate and cream beautifully the way it is supposed to. If you use cold butter in the beater bowl, you are going to cause damage. If you use the metal beater bowl with the attachments and cold butter, the attachments will break even if the bowl is okay. If you use cold butter with the plastic beater bowl and the attachments, you are likely to break both. Unfortunately, although it really is best to avoid cold butter with the Ankarsrum, I note that there are a very small number of instances where you do need to use cold butter in your baking. So these are my personal suggestions for how to use cold butter if you really have to do so. Please note, I am not a professional baker. I am entirely self-taught and I am in no way an expert. So if you follow my recommendations, you should take that into account. The first method is fairly straightforward. This is for when you need to use the sablage method to make a pie dough. In this particular instance, you take the cold butter cubes and you mix them together with the flour until you get a sandy texture. With conventional stand mixers, you can put in the flour and sugar and the butter in the machine, and the machine will basically beat the butter into submission. In contrast, if you want to use the Ankarsrum to do sablage, you cannot use brute force, and so these are my suggestions. First, you will need to combine the cold butter with the flour and the sugar separately before you add it to the Ankarsrum. You can do this with a food processor, which will give you an extremely even sandy texture. Alternatively, you can do it by hand. I prefer to do it by hand because I find it very relaxing and therapeutic to press cold butter into flour. It also smells very nice. I use gloves when I'm doing this. Not only is it less messy, but it reduces the melting of the butter. Essentially, I just rub the butter and the flour against my fingertips until I end up with whatever texture I want. Sometimes this is a very fine and sandy crumb, or sometimes you want to have bigger chunks of butter if you want a more flaky texture. Typically, the next step is that you would make a well in the dry ingredients and add the wet. The wet ingredients are usually egg or iced water, and you would put them in the middle of the dry ingredients. In contrast, if I'm using the Ankarsrum, what I do at this point is that I put the liquids into the main bowl together with the dough knife and the dough roller. While the machine is spinning on its lowest setting, I add the dry ingredients into the bowl and I move the dough roller around until everything is incorporated. I then scrape everything down, roll the dough into a ball, press it down into a disc, wrap it in plastic wrap, and chill for whatever time is required. There are a small number of cookie recipes that for whatever reason require you to have cold butter. They usually claim that it's for the texture. For the purposes of this demonstration, I have selected a modified version of a Cupcake Gemma NYC cookie. This self-styled NYC cookie is essentially her copycat version of the famous New York City Levain cookie from the Levain bakery. If you do not know the Levain cookie, it is an extremely large and chunky chocolate chip cookie that has an extremely high ratio of chocolate chips in it compared to the dough. What this means is that the center of the cookie is extremely gooey because of the melted chocolate and quasi-raw cookie dough. The craze has since passed, but for a time this was a massively popular cookie on the internet, spawning dozens and dozens of copycat recipes that used a number of different techniques. I experimented with the Cupcake Gemma copycat recipe for a while, and I liked it very well for a short time because they do have a large variety of flavors. However, over time, I discovered another Levain copycat recipe that I preferred much more and I still use to this day. I should add that I discovered that recipe even before I had the Ankarsrum, just because I preferred using the creaming method for making these cookies. Nonetheless, when I wanted to find a demo cookie recipe to make that used cold butter, this recipe immediately came to mind. Part of the reason I don't like this recipe anymore is that aside from the annoyance of using cold butter, it's just a very fiddly cookie recipe that has a lot of unnecessary steps in it. It also results in a very large and sweet cookie. I know I'm not selling it very well, but at the end of the day, I'm just using this as a demo recipe. Cupcake gemmers people are very emphatic that you must use cold chunks of butter, and then when you mix it with the sugar, you don't want it to be creamed or incorporated. You actually want to end up with small little cold nuggets of butter and sugar, and then you add the other ingredients to that. Their claim is that this is what leads to the requisite texture in the cookie. I don't necessarily agree, but I'm just going to go with their recipe. So what I did was I not only cubed the cold butter, I chopped it into extremely small pieces. Actually, as you'll see from the photograph, I'm very lazy, so to call these pieces extremely small is a little bit of an overstatement. Let's just say that I chopped these bits of butter smaller than you would usually cube butter. I then put the butter in the main bowl of the mixer, added the brown and the white sugars, and I then gave it a quick stir with a spatula to coat the butter with the sugar. This was so that even though it would mix together, hopefully it wouldn't cream. As you can see, when I first turned on the mixer, there was a bit of clumping. I decided not to manually lock the roller in place a small distance from the wall of the bowl. Instead, what I did was I kept the roller in its default position against the wall of the bowl, but I manually moved the roller back and forth so that there was space for the butter and sugar to mix around and combine, but not cream. After that, things proceeded as a normal recipe, and I just added the ingredients as I normally would, although it did require more intervention than usual in terms of moving the dough roller around to make sure that all of the ingredients were well incorporated.
I'm gonna transform with Ankarsrum. I feel the beat mixing up my recipes, creating something sweet. Mixing up my recipes, sit up, let the beats go live. In my kitchen, I'm on the rise. Ankarsrum, a mixer that's right for me. Listen to the bowl spinning round and round. Listen to that amazing and glorious sound. Spinning round and round.
I modified this recipe so that my mix-ins were chopped up Cadbury caramel chocolate and crushed Lotus Biscoff biscuits. If you don't know caramilk, the Australian and UK caramilk are different to the Canadian one, which is literally a chocolate filled with caramel. Australian caramilk is a white chocolate that has been caramelized. If you can't buy it, you can make it yourself with a conventional oven or a microwave, but it's way easier to just buy it. It's quite time consuming to make. Before I started making the cookie dough, I had already scooped out teaspoonfuls of Biscoff cookie butter and frozen them in the freezer. The cupcake gemma recipe makes massive cookies that are around 100 to 150 grams each, and that doesn't include the Biscoff. Eating that much biscuit would make me feel sick, so I made these ones smaller, although they're still on the large side for our household, around 60 to 70 grams each. I did make a few large ones just in case my nephews come to visit. Anyway, this is what they look like once they are baked. I hope that this video was useful. I would still caution people against using cold butter. Frequently, even a recipe that calls for cold butter for a biscuit or a cookie is just a personal preference of the individual who made the recipe. And if you Google, you may be able to find an equivalent recipe that does not require cold butter. The other workaround that I've seen people recommend is to freeze a block of butter and then grate the butter into the bowl. I'm not sure that's necessary, but I'm just putting that out as another option. Thanks.